All right. Well, welcome everyone. I'm really excited to be here. My name is William Horne. I'm a postdoctoral fellow at Villanova University and editor of the Activist History Review. And I'm really excited to be a part of this conversation where we're thinking through anti-carceral veganism and what that means and what sort of broadening our perspective of life and rights might mean for us as as human animals, and then for others as non-human animals. So I'm gonna ask each of our presenters to introduce themselves and give a little bit of an overview of their work. And then we'll go ahead and talk through some questions and think through what anti-carceral veganism has to offer us.
My name is Leah Gruen, and I am a philosopher, and I do a variety of different kinds of work, primarily concerned about carceral logics in general in very broad terms, and the ethics of captivity. I've done a lot of work in feminist theory, anti-Black racist theory, and prison studies, and of course animal studies and animal ethics. And I edited a volume called The Ethics of Captivity in 2014, and that was really one of the first books that brought together people who are incarcerated and people who work with animals who are in various forms of captive engagement, and as well as philosophical reflection on that work. I've been doing a lot of work in prisons. I have been teaching philosophy in various prisons, men's and women's prisons, for over a decade. And most recently, I'm working with Justin on a book project. We're editing on carceral logics, and maybe Justin will tell us more about that. Happy to be here and interested in how the conversation goes. Oh, and I want to apologize if my dogs bark in the background. I will try to mute myself, but they may bark.
So Leah, would you go ahead?
Oh yeah. So hello everybody. My name is Leah. I am a food writer, and my work kind of overlaps with queerness, veganism, and more recently labor. I am from rural Indiana, and I recently, within the last 6 years, came to New York to study at NYU in the food studies program, where I kind of focused a lot of my work on kind of the cultural connections between queer liberation and animal liberation. And that's kind of where I found, most of my interests lie, as well as within like the scope of food writing, kind of looking at interconnections between food justice, racial justice, and veganism.
So, should I go? Well,
yeah, please. I'm sorry. Yeah.
There came the awkward pause anyway. I am Justin Marceau. I'm a law professor, and I think, unlike a lot of people, I came to animals and interests in animal studies through law, as opposed to being interested in animal and then wondering what our social structures and law could do for it. So I just had the benefit of being able to be exposed to it in law school a little bit, and have stuck with it. As a law professor, I focus on constitutional law, specifically the First Amendment, free speech, and Fourth, Fifth, Sixth, and Eighth Amendments, sort of criminal procedure rights, and animal law, of course. And I'm sort of a big believer that the lawyers, what they bring is some external knowledge, not sort of coming in and just saying I like animals. And so I entered animal law through constitutional law initially, and in that venture was popular, right? So I was looking at bringing some free speech expertise to egg gag laws and things like that. And then more recently, I have been focused on sort of my background in criminal law and how that intersects with animal law. And, you know, by way of background on my thinking on these, I was thinking that it might be useful to just share a hypothetical, and then I'll open it up to the questions from Will. But the hypothetical it's not so hypothetical, but if you imagined a United States where animal cruelty and neglect was a crime, indeed a felony in every state, and then it happened that there was an opportunity to, some would say update, some would say expand the felony law and have a new felony law at the federal level. What would that look like, right? What would we imagine a new system? So it's already a crime. It's already a misdemeanor and a felony in both states. How valuable would it be to have a felony law? And then if you imagine further that this new felony law was going to exempt animals that were raised in factory farms, and it was going to exempt animals that were used in entertainment, and exempt animals that were used in research, then how do you think one would react to that law if you just approached a person? And so the reaction that I was going to posit is, this is the greatest thing for animals that has happened in decades, right? And so I'd say, well, who do you think says that, right? Is it the average person on the street protesting a mask ordinance, or who says that, right? Politician, an animal group. And it turns out that it's equally likely that it's an animal person, an animal protection advocate, as it is a politician who's been pushing sort of tough on crime propaganda, right? So the day after, in December of 2019, the PACT Act, a new federal felony, was in fact enacted in this country. And the very next day, one of the leaders of a large animal protection group in the United States declared that it was the largest victory for animals in years. At the signing statement for that bill, the president, Donald Trump, was greeted with the message that, quote, in a single stroke of the pen, this president has done more to protect animals than anyone in history, end quote, which you can imagine the president responded with, I agree with that, well said, and he did. So there is this sense that if we pass another felony, a duplicative felony, a felony that another sovereign could prosecute on top of already existing felons, we may have done the greatest thing ever in history for animals. And this comes from both politicians and from the movement itself. And that's sort of what I'm interested in.
Yeah, that seems like a great segue into sort of the first question that came to mind when I was thinking through each of your work, which is, what is the connection to your mind between the institutional treatment of non-human animals, be it on farms or in other exploitive areas, between that and mass incarceration? How do you see those two as related?
Well, I would just say, and to start with that, it's important that you framed it as related as opposed to as a comparison, because there's a way in which so many of these sort of structures of, let's just call them for simplicity, structures of oppression operate. And there's within the animal movement, there's a conflation of all of these very distinctive structures. So I'm glad that you said, how are they related, as opposed to how are they similar? Because in many ways they're fundamentally different. And there's a lot of important senses in which they're different. But I think there is a way that conceptualize, and forgive me, this is my philosophical background, but conceptualizing others that have their lives at the hands of those in power, those with control, have been harmed and violated in virtue of this very distinctive power relation that exists. And I think that's a way in which they're related. The system of mass incarceration disproportionately impacts, as we know, primarily Black people, but also Latinx people. And there is, we all know this, but there's a large and important history of that conceptualization of criminality that comes straight out of slavery. So, in fact, it's only your freedom after, during Reconstruction, after emancipation, freedom was allowed unless you committed a crime, and then you lose it. So there's a sense in which the desire to control others via mass incarceration and the desire to control others via mass production of food or other forms of animal use and exploitation, there's the same people who benefit from those systems, those various systems. That's one way to think about it, I think.
Yeah, and I think another way, I remember reading this anecdote about Angela Davis when she was arrested and when she was put in what was called the House of D, which is a jail in the West Village in New York. And it was known as like a prison or a jail that was predominantly queer people, specifically lesbians and non-binary people. And it was there that she was fed maggot-infested meat, and she decided to become a vegetarian, or she decided to stop eating meat at that point. And from that experience, she became a vegetarian. And this is like, this is someone part of the Black Panthers and the Black Power movement who has been deemed a terrorist and who has been, wrongfully incarcerated. And through that experience and in being in a very queer space, then comes to this realization of those connections of, like the objectification of animals and these kind of carceral politics at play. And I think that that's a kind of, that moment is a great way of thinking about like the connections of white supremacy and colonialism and capitalism, and those, like how those are enmeshed and how those are really at the root of, it's kind of one and the same, but it's at the root of these institutions that are very different, have their own specific histories. And I appreciate Lori saying that, like the kind of vegan movement and kind of mainstream animal advocacy has done a disservice of conflating those histories and usually at the expense of, the histories of enslaved people to draw attention towards confined animals and animal agriculture. So it's important to remember that those are separate histories, but that at the core is a very much like a white supremacist root and ideology.
Now, if I could just add one more thing about this, that one of the things that I've found in my relations with incarcerated people is that there's often a tremendous amount of solidarity that they feel for animals that are being used in these systems. And so that what you said about Angela Davis is actually right. It's not so much that there's so what people get fed in carceral institutions is not. It's not something that you would probably call food, but there's nonetheless an awareness of and solidarity that many people experience once they are aware of the ways that animals are treated in a variety of contexts. And I think also it's really important to note how hard it is to be vegan in prison, which is another, I think, interesting challenge that we might want to talk about.
Yeah, I think those are great answers. I may wait to chime in later. I'll say one thing on this sort of theme of how the oppressions are connected here between sort of thinking about incarceration generally and incarceration and the animal protection movement that the other two didn't touch on, which is just to say the histories are certainly complicated. I mean, there's enough depravity to go around for sure. But in the modern time, right now in 2020, when I think about what's happening and why someone would think that carceral veganism, to use your title, is a good thing. And I should just note, I mean, it's worth conversing. I wonder what you three and others think, if there are that many vegans that are carceral, because it's sort of carceral animal advocates, right? I mean, my sense is, and it may be skewed, it's anecdotal, but the people that I meet who are have these sort of carceral logics, they're deeply embedded. They rarely identify as vegan, right? They sort of find that term off-putting or something like that, but I'm interested. And so anyway, applying that logic, I think that one of the things that I'm going to put in some research I've been doing for the book that Lori mentioned that we're working on, I've shown something that I don't think has been shown yet, which is that as in other areas of criminal law, perhaps as a surprise to no one except the animal lawyers, it turns out that persons of color identify as knowing people or themselves much more often who have been charged with animal cruelty or animal neglect than persons who are white. And at the same time, I've been able to I've found that, you know, again, not a surprising trend perhaps for those who study criminology, like Will, but that in fact, that the inverse is true when it comes to support for carceral or heavier penalties for animal abuse. So the persons who are most likely someone who was charged with abuse come from marginalized communities, and the persons who are most likely to support a punitive response to animal cruelty are predominantly white and have higher incomes.
That's really interesting, and it touches on something that Leah said that sort of grabbed my attention, that there's a relationship perhaps between white supremacy and animal cruelty. And I wonder, I guess, if that's something that maybe we can explore a little bit more together. And I'll say I study racism and white supremacy, and you know, encounter that very little in that particular literature, but it sounds like there's a lot more to work with from the animal rights perspective.
Yeah, I mean, that a lot of kind of my understandings with those connections have come from reading people like, you know, Afko, like her more recent book, Racism as Zoological Witchcraft, is really insightful in thinking about how white supremacy is both anti-Black and anti-animal, and that it uses that it's also inherently zoological, like it's inherently kind of like builds its power upon animalizing others, and so animalizing humans and then objectifying animals and kind of blurring those lines, because that ability to kind of the license to be cruel is because someone can be seen as an animal. And so that kind of like relationship informing, so that, yeah, that kind of like is what informs like that thought. And I know that she's not the only one that has written about that. I know Breeze Harper also talks a little bit about that, as well as possibly Carol Adams.
Yeah, Lori, do you want to speak? I mean, yeah, and Claire Kim has written on that as well. I think, I mean, to me, I think I'm not an expert on that topic. I think it's a critically important one, and I think that what Leah said is exactly right. That my more rudimentary understanding is really grounded in the same sort of thinking, which is that in order to be able, whether it's genocide, murder, oppression of any sort, right? You have to be able to trivialize that suffering to some level and have some justification for that trivializing of the suffering of the other. And I think that is, it's a strain of white supremacy that, you know, is relevant here.
Yeah, I think also it's really important to understand that the very sort of categories of the human and the animal, and I sort of disagree a little bit with Af on this, that the categories of the human and the animal are actually constructed categories. They're not biological, they're not zoological, they're actually parts of a constructed framework. And it is a framework that Zakiya Jackson has a new book out called Becoming Human that really delves into the ways in which the very notion of what it means to be a human is fundamentally normative at the get-go. And by normative here, I mean that it's a way of thinking about a certain kind of class of beings, and you can include certain people in the category of human, and then you create another category of subhuman or not quite human or not yet human. And you can think about that in terms of gender, I think, as well, in a really important sense, because, there is this not just white supremacy, but there's sort of kind of patriarchy that is operating. And the patriarchy doesn't work where it's all men are one way and all women are subordinated. It's actually a system where there's a particular kind of man that's held up, and that's a white man, and that's a cis white man, and that's a particular kind of person. And then there's a hierarchy of being that follows from that, and it's not as clearly binary as we're led to think, in the same way that the human-animal connection isn't as binary as we're led to think. So I think it's really important to sort of start to think about what it is that we're imagining and what we're taught. I mean, essentially it's what we're taught. And I think that a lot, just to go back to what Justin was saying earlier, I mean, I think the animal movement itself is actually not, or I mean, whether they're taught or not, but they think, which is kind of surprising to me. I'd like to hear what other people say. Like, why would you think that bringing the police into the situation is a good, why would you think that's a good thing? But especially for animal activists who themselves have problems with the police. So I think there's a sort of real kind of chaotic view that really needs to get evaluated. And now's as good a time as any to do that reevaluation.
Yeah. I mean, it's such a good point. I mean, there's this sort of schizophrenia when it comes to the police and the prosecutors in the movement, right? I talk about this a little bit in my book. It's you have a sense that the animal movement is just hoarding capital with prosecutors and the criminal system, right? They're doing all these things. They're giving awards. They are sponsoring the American Prosecutors Association. They are, paying for prosecutors. They say, whenever you want a brief, we will do it. They're there. They're at the ready. And then you have activists engaging in direct action, and like Glenn Greenwald wrote about last month, exposing pigs tortured to death, where you just shut off the ventilation system and put in heat and steam and see how long it takes for them to die. And it would be controversial among these organizations to then step in and say, well, maybe we should offer some lawyers for this fight, or maybe we should leverage our relationship with the prosecutors to say, hey, these animals are victims, right? If our mantra is animal victims, maybe the fact that they just tortured to death 1,000 animals might be relevant to our mission, but we say, no, no, no. And that's where I think the victimhood, I mean, there's lots of problems with sort of treating animals just as victims and tokenizing them in that way. But I think that this idea of animals as victim, which is often what we see, it's a familiar rhetoric, right? We're just borrowing from the 1990s and before on the war on crime, but borrow from this logic of victimhood to say, well, we've got to recognize animals as victims. But then when there's a large scale killing and the victims are there, kind of exposes the absurdity that Lori's talking about. Like, are we really friends with the prosecutors? Because they're going to go and prosecute these activists. And are we going to say anything about that? Well, we don't want to, because we don't want to make them mad. That would look bad for us if we were on the wrong side of the prosecutors, right? So there's this real tension, right? And it forces, I think the law to always be conservative, but it forces the lawyers into this position where they're trying to look, not radical, but there's, in a very conscious way, right? It's strange, right? I mean, because like Lori said, there's this ladder of nature that's being reproduced, and it goes all the way to what victims matter, right? I mean, that's why I was careful in my introduction to just say, imagine, even if you liked felony statutes, coming out and saying this is such a huge victory when you've exempted 99% of the animal suffering in the country, right? Even if you thought criminal law was a good idea, would you come forward and say, well, I know this only applies basically to dogs and cats, but I mean, it's still a huge deal because we're going to have more people that can be prosecuted for felony law, right? And Wayne Pacelli recently came out and said, we got to expand the criminal bureaucracy and have a Department of Justice, a program dedicated at DOJ specifically to prosecuting animal cruelty crimes. Right? We ought to expand the bureaucracy at this moment, which is it's baffling to me. And I don't know what we think we're going to get from that.
Yeah, it is kind of, it's interesting, especially like the kind of the idea of the way undercover footage is like manipulated in this very counterproductive way. Like on the one hand, undercover, whatever report investigators can potentially be treated as terrorists and incarcerated. But in the same breath, animal advocacy groups, which I think are largely, at least some of them like Mercy for Animals, run by people who identify as vegan, can use that same footage to push for the incarceration of the workers, the individual workers themselves. And so it's in both cases, you're giving power to the state to put more people in prison. And like this idea of veganizing, the criminal justice system, like what that doesn't actually help us. And I like what you mentioned, Justin, about like, do vegans actually subscribe to this? And I think it's kind of different how it plays out. It's never spoken about in the way we're talking about so plainly. I think there are a lot of vegan publications that do promote this idea that this was a win for animals, that this animal abuser went to jail or was arrested, and the context is removed of this was a person of color who's a low-wage slaughterhouse worker and is also experiencing extreme discrimination and exploitation, and that it's, there's someone in line behind them to take this job, even if they're being, arrested, whereas the people who are making the decisions that create this kind of scaffolding of cruelty are not held liable. And so I think it's about how that gets kind of translated into the public, and the language that gets used and the context that gets removed. And because so many of these organizations are run by nice white liberals, they really don't understand the stakes because they personally haven't kind of had to grapple with them and politically haven't engaged with that kind of work, like prison abolition and racial justice, perhaps.
Right. No, that's a great point.
So is there a space or is there a role for legislation and litigation within the animal rights movement? Or is that sort of, ultimately a self-defeating enterprise? Does it contribute to sort of oppressive bureaucracies? What do y'all think?
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to take a first stab at it because as a lawyer, the others can then critique me. I think there is a place for it. I think it's really important. I think it's important to keep pressing these matters. But my view is the legislation is all geared towards. There's a sense. My perception in talking to these people, and then sort of from the emails and discussed with my work recently that I've heard, is that I don't appreciate the critique that I hear most often is that I don't appreciate that this is incrementally better for animals. That it's incrementalism, that I'm opposing incrementalism, and that's what I most reject. I think that this is somehow incrementally helping the animals' cause. To imagine that we could pass new legislation or that sort of thing, but I don't think that means there's no space for interventions in law, right? So, in New York, as I talked about in my book, there's lots of cases of young Black men being prosecuted for a single act of cruelty, kicking a cat or something like that. And you have just down the road, from headquarters of national organizations, foie gras facility. I don't want to go into the details here, but by the plain letter of New York's criminal code, it's not at all apparent to a criminal lawyer that the production of foie gras in New York is not criminal. It seems to meet the definition in the statute. So you could say, well, is this corporation that is held, should that corporation be prosecuted? And I think that's an interesting question, right? Like I understand that there's still scapegoating and blame and shifting. It doesn't bother me at this moment in my thinking to imagine that the foie gras producer would be targeted for engaging in animal cruelty. So that would be an example of using the law as it exists. And then in terms of doing more, right? I mean, there's so much we can do across all different levels, and it's sort of these conversations are important for forming alliances and thinking what it would look like. I recently had an email where a prosecutor told me that I just didn't understand that climate change stuff, I don't remember the three topics, but climate change, the other things that I had mentioned in a talk, were all irrelevant because they were too far removed from animals, and that the prosecution stuff provides a direct benefit to animals, right? So there's this sense that if you focus on prosecution, you're doing something directly for the animals. I don't know what that something is, but if you were working on climate change law, or you were working on anti-poverty or supporting income or something like that, that you are not helping animals at all. But if you are prosecuting someone, you are, right? And it's sort of, I've heard that message a lot. So I think that one of the things that I like to think about is just how could we imagine taking that view and deconstructing it, asking the lawyers to think more closely and to imagine, what do you imagine is the incremental benefit you're getting? Do you think you're getting some small payout that we're just not seeing beyond fundraising? But I'm not opposed to law reform efforts.
Well, one of the things that I worry about, and I mean, I think you're talking, Will, about legislation of a criminal variety, right? So, it seems that as an abolitionist, it's difficult. I mean, as much as I might want to say, I'd like to see the fragua,
Right.
people, prosecuted. I don't actually know that this is the right way either to do anything for animals,
Right.
or to sort of change people's thinking about the structures of control that are so central, and I talked about a minute ago, that are so central to the system. And so it doesn't seem to me, I mean, again, this is just my more extreme take, but it doesn't seem to me that in any way, so I would much rather it be the case that animal groups were working to try to compel, convince, explain, change the people who are participating in the cruelty practice, rather than have this extra system of control to try to make it so that, people are trying to figure out their ways around the system, so they don't have to think ethically or politically themselves. And so, I mean, I understand it might be very helpful in an immediate kind of case, but I would like it much better if the animal movement had a big part of it rethinking what our relationships should look like, what our relationships with each other should look like, what our relationships with systems of anti-Black racism, how we might rethink those, how we can think about sort of all levels of exploitation and oppression of all sorts of beings, human and non-human beings. And so to use a system that's fundamentally a hammer, because it's also going to be a crude vehicle, it's not going to be one that's going to have much nuance, it sort of recapitulates the very problems that I think we're talking about. So I'm less in favor of thinking about how to make criminal laws better than for animals for that reason.
Yeah, if I could just quickly jump in. Sorry, Leah, you should speak. I think that's right. I mean, I'm close to there. My only potential disagreement, and I'm still thinking about this, is that as in other areas, if you could use the existing law to raise the price of doing business, right? I don't imagine any individual prosecution. It still props up a system, just like Laura said. I mean, all these conversations going on right now, it still props up a system that I think is fundamentally broken. So that's a problem. But if you could raise the price of foie gras, we're talking about the corporate liability, which is just really never done. It's not even explored, right? If you look at the legal literature on corporate liability, criminal law reforms, it's all how would you minimize the reform so there's less damage to the shareholder, right? There's reforms for how you would make the individuals more liable, but not the entity, the fictional entity itself. So I don't know. I think there's some possibilities there, but I generally agree. And I mean, at bottom, if I'm talking about criminal law, I would say, William Kunstler had it right? That the best thing that the lawyer can do is get out of the way and defend the activists, right? I mean, I think that's fundamentally the absence of defense for activists in the animal movement in this country is shocking, frankly.
And I just want to clarify. So I was just talking about criminal law. I wasn't thinking of legislative efforts. So I mean, yes, that's going to be helpful.
I would agree with you, Lori. Like I think that the relationships that animal advocates and animal rights activists create across industries and across movements is so important. And in thinking that no one effort is just for animals. I mean, I think that we have to think kind of collectively. And I think that, prosecution, unless it is, I mean, in the current system, like, I don't think that that's a really productive way of trying to reduce harm. I think it will inevitably cause more harm and create more loopholes for more harm. And because we live under white supremacist capitalism, that harm will inevitably target marginalized groups more than it will target the, like, well-to-do foie gras farmer. It will always find a way. And so putting our efforts in, like, forms that are more restorative or rehabilitative, like this, foie gras doesn't exist because someone wasn't prosecuted for it. Like, there's a lot of re-education that needs to happen around, like, compassion and empathy. And most unfortunately, a lot of the groups right now kind of go for the clickbait and go for this reductionist view of just isolating this moment of animal suffering and even individualizing the animal, naming them and, like, kind of giving them a backstory to create compassion, rather than thinking about, like, collectively, how do these moments of cruelty actually affect all kinds of people, including, like, the environmental racism that's happening, in the backdrop that's often unseen.
Yeah, I teach a race and capitalism course, and we look a lot at farm work in the ways that it's exploitive, particularly in relation to marginalized and oppressed people. And I wonder, is there a way that, maybe we could be thinking or talking more about how, a more robust vision of animal rights and a more an honest approach to our shared ecology, I guess, might lead to a better working and living conditions for, people in those types of situations. I don't know. What do y'all think? What's your sense?
The Food Empowerment Project, which is an amazing organization, works really closely with farm workers and farm workers' families, and raises questions about the importance of veganism and the labor conditions on farms. And so I think one of the things that's really important also, we're talking about the animal movement, but the animal movement is there's so many different kinds of organizations and activists doing all sorts of work. And I think there's a lot of different emphases, particularly on thinking about sort of all sorts of conditions. So there's also some of the farm sanctuaries are trying to help local farmers transition from the kinds of, let's say, so-called small dairying, which is really disastrous for dairy cows, and trying to help those individuals and people figure out new ways of making a living, which is a very real part of what it is that often brings people to do the kind of production that they're doing. So I think there are a lot of opportunities for thinking about within the system to a certain extent, right? So there's ways that we can think about how do we critique the capitalist system. That's one thing. But then there's sort of an in-between that I don't think is necessarily reformist, in which what we're doing is thinking about how to empower people who are both workers and or maybe say in the sort of system of vertical integration in mass production of food products. There's often various kinds of people at different levels of power privileged class that are engaged in this process. So how to empower them to imagine an alternative to the kind of animal exploitation that they're engaged in. And there are groups that are already doing that and have been doing that for quite a long time within the movement. So learning from them is one way to do it, but expanding and including those kinds of perspectives in some of the larger, more well-known organizations, I think would also be really useful.
Yeah, and there has been, you know, I think remarkable shifts even in the messaging. You know, like, for example, I mean, Mercy for Animals is a good example. It was, you know, kind of once led by, you know, Nathan Runkle, you know, a white cis gay man who was definitely penning the words that, you know, felony charges are a success and a win for animals. And now it is, you know, run by a woman of color. And I know that they're doing more work trying to engage across movement lines. I think there's still a lot of work left to be done. And I think that, I don't know, like, rather than try to, I don't know, like, I feel like that I would rather put efforts in supporting people who have, like you said, Lori, have always been doing this work, like Lauren Arnelis of the Food Empowerment Project, like Michelle Carrera of Chili's on Wheels, or like Veggie Mijas, which is a great collective of women and queer people of color discussing these very issues. I mean, also we have to acknowledge this is an all-white panel, so we bring a very specific perspective. Like we know to a certain extent what needs to be done, but I think the biggest thing is the people who are most affected by these issues having the decision-making power and informing the campaigns that happen and informing the work that gets done. Right now, it's still predominantly a lot of very affluent and privileged white people. And so I think that that needs to shift. I mean, we're seeing this conversation happen across, you know, industries, right? Like, I mean, I'm in the food world, and that's like, there's been these really big shifts in challenging power and challenging like legacy holders of power, and the beyond the politics of diversity and kind of liberal politics of, you know, putting up the rainbow flag and posting the black square, but like kind of what's at the core, what's behind it, what are those actual political principles that are informing the work. And I think within the vegan movement, like, and it is so multifaceted and so diverse as far as like the different, you know, whatever, like beliefs and ideologies. But that kind of reckoning, I think, really needs to happen, and that we say, well, what actually are the politics informing this work? And as the language and the ideas around prison abolition continue to flourish like they, you know, have just within the last few months since the murder of George Floyd, and this kind of language becoming very mainstream and very accessible to all kinds of people, it's inevitable that this conversation has to be taken seriously within the, you know, broad vegan movement of these carceral politics, and how our choices from wearing, you know, like a vegan police t-shirt that seems really cute and, you know, playful, what does that say to, you know, the headlines that praise the Israeli Defense Force for having, you know, vegan meals and vegan woolen berets, and kind of this not just US militarization and you know, mass incarceration, but also globally, like, how are these relationships being connected, and like, what are the politics underneath them? And also, you know, like, what is the vegan brand doing? Or kind of that deficiency of relying on the vegan brand as progressive in and of itself, when in fact, you know, it's not. It has to be girded by real, like, comprehensive liberation, or the desire for liberation for all people. And that, I don't know, I feel like, and that's, you know, I know very idealistic, but I think we do have to challenge those organizations beyond kind of the performance of, you know, empathy and the kind of just hashtag vegan for the animals. It's just not enough.
Yeah, I think that's great. I mean,
sorry for rambling. That was
great.
I really appreciate both of you. It's really insightful. I really appreciate both of you flagging the existence of groups that are looking for alliances. I guess what I would say is, and I can't speak to all, I think the three that were mentioned, but I'm not going to call organizations by name, but certainly a couple of the organizations that were mentioned, which I love the work they're doing, they don't stand up against what we're calling, I guess, carceral veganism at the moment, right? So I have definitely been on panels and at places where the heads of those organizations that were just that stand up for the workers, that do the rest, have, applauded, given awards to, said, this is the greatest thing. We just got a new felony law, and now animals are serious in state X, right? So, even as we talk about the groups that are doing it right, there's still this notion that they get a pass when it comes to the criminal. So I think it's, to pretend that there was one group that back had figured it out is maybe a little bit different than the perspective I have. But I totally agree that there's great stuff happening.
I wonder if I can be provocative just for a minute. I wonder, is it possible to be vegan without embracing abolition? It seems to me that sort of if you draw veganism out to like its most, fundamental assertions of rights of living beings, that ultimately you must embrace abolition, right? Is that correct?
I wish that were true, actually, but I think that I really appreciate what Justin just said too. I think that, just going back to what we said earlier, I think there's just a general acceptance of this carceral system that's actually sometimes unreflective. I really do think that even people who are, absolutely committed to what they imagine as being gender justice and racial justice and and justice for animals haven't really thought hard about the carceral logic that underpins our society and most societies. So I think I think in a theoretical or in an idealized way, it seems to me very much a central part of what it means to have full liberation. But I think that we're never even vegan. So I don't think so these are aspirations that we're trying to move towards a kind of liberation that we may never get to. I think, though, unfortunately, I think these conversations are really important, but I also think if you think about the way that, so I'm older than y'all, so I can talk about the movement from way back when, but it was the, abolition within the movement was very much tied to a particular person, Eric Francione, and a very particular way of thinking about what the movement was about. And for him, veganism is the baseline and abolition is what's necessary. But he wasn't an abolitionist in this old-fashioned sense of abolitionist, or the abolitionist against sort of prisons, or an abolitionist against police. So I think that there's a sense in which, even within the vegan movement for the last 30, 40 years, abolition has meant something very specific that isn't the same as what we're talking about tonight. Any other?
Yeah, I think it's such a great point. I mean, it's a provocative question, as you meant, Will, but I have an animal lawyer colleague who was wearing, sometime during this period when we were having a Zoom talk, a defund the police shirt or pin, and it was very much like Leah said. And this person is a dear friend, but she also readily accepts and is part of the idea that we need more felony cruelty laws, right? I mean, and I think that, we haven't had this conversation specifically since, in the last 2 months, say, but I think that, one, in the animal rights movement, people think that they can be for defund the police, but you have to still fund the animal police, right? You need an animal police, or we've left the animals voiceless. And I think that what Lori said is so important, because this really gets to the underpinning, right? Is like there is an assumption that we need to start thinking bigger. We need to start looking for alliances. We need to do all kinds of things with farmers. We need to look at all these different outlets and inlets. But we take as a given that maybe some sort of a pretty high level of carceral logic should be tolerated. Right? And I was just looking, you probably have all seen it, I'm not sure, but there's a Human Rights Quarterly article, 2019. And it's really interesting. I've cited it in a couple of different things I've done, but it talks about how persons who consider themselves not vegan, but interested in animal rights is the question, have all of these other correlations with things that the authors treat as human rights issues, right? So, compassion towards gender issues, and there's a list of like 12 different things they look at. But what's really interesting, if you unpack their analysis that is celebrating the human rights orientation of the animal protection movement, in ranking, they have 3 different ways they study this, but one of the ways is to look state by state and say, well, so which states are best for animals, and then which states have these progressive laws that say prevent discrimination on the basis of gender or something like that, sexual orientation. What do we have on the state level? But the way they rank the states is based on the rankings from the national animal organizations that say you get a higher ranking if you have more felonies, right? You get a higher ranking, like you can't be a top ranked state unless you do this, right? It doesn't matter you ban captivity for cetaceans. It doesn't matter that you ban battery cages. You need to make sure you have a felony first offense, right? Or you get knocked down to at least 25. And so even these really top, some of them are Harvard researchers doing really cutting edge human rights research, took for granted the rankings of these organizations. And that speaks, I think, it's just part of our basic assumption is that, oh yeah, there's states that are good and there's states that are bad. What states are good? Oh, well, there's animal groups that rank it. Of course, they must know. Right? It's so ingrained, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with what both of you are saying. I think it's, you don't really see it until you see it, and maybe you could see it in one way. And I think that's why language matters. To say defund the police isn't actually going far enough. When you remove the word, abolish, I think it makes it easy to confuse things, or to confuse that you can have one without the other. And I fully agree that even the word itself has been kind of bastardized within the vegan movement because, again, of like these people that carry so much privilege, they don't really see the ways in which they are stealing and kind of like exploiting, movements for Black people, movements for marginalized people, and actually taking that attention and taking that meaning and making a new meaning that really isn't at all like what that is. And so I guess we have to read more. I guess we have to read more radical leftist literature and really ground our ideas and our campaigns and our thoughts in real principles that actually do have depth, and actually mean something versus, this kind of, very, as you said earlier, kind of like scatterbrained and kind of inconsistent activism.
Yeah, it does seem like we're dealing with sort of a reactive activism, that sort of is reacting to and using the carceral state versus one that is more, I hesitate to use the word almost, but utopian, one that embraces a vision of, total liberation. And I guess since we're running short on time and getting towards the end here, maybe can you give everyone just like one thing maybe that they can do tomorrow to support, total liberation for non-human and human animals?
Well, I would say, find a group that is, if right now, I mean, there's monetary and there's ideological and then there's your physical time, right? So ideologically, start reading, read really sound leftist political theory that is grounded in prison abolition. So read Mariam Kaba, read Angela Davis, and still be critical, these are not perfect people. I think letting go of the idea of perfection and all good and all bad and these really false binaries is really helpful. And then find, if you're giving money to, these large organizations right now, stop it. They don't need your money and they don't deserve it. Stop giving to them because they are propping up the carceral state. Find other ways to get involved locally and to try to find ways to actually engage personally with more like restorative justice measures and just like, yeah.
I also want to add, I mean, we're still living in COVID times, and I would really encourage people to, if you don't give your money to the big animal groups, give it to bail funds. Please give it to bail funds. People are getting arrested in BLM protests. People are sitting in prisons and jails across the country where the virus is still active, and they haven't even been, they haven't even gone to court yet, and they can't go to court because there isn't court in many places because of the virus. So there's all sorts of local, it has to be local. Well, it doesn't have to be, but the bail funds tend to be in particular states. But definitely, if you're thinking about contributing money, bail funds need the money.
Yeah, I will of course agree with both of those suggestions, and only for the sake of, I guess, not being contrary, because I'm not saying you should give money to the big organizations, but I think it's really important to engage with the big organizations. And I think that a big thing that we all can and should be doing that are reading these things that Leah is talking about is engage with them, right? And have an opportunity, right? When I talk to these organizations, because I have done pro bono work for them and worked with them on different things, like the response from most of the lawyers is like, get out of here. We're not about activists. We don't get in with those like crazy leftists, and this prison abolition stuff is nonsense. And I mean, there is a strong tradition of sort of conservative thought entrenched in some of these for various reasons, many of which Leah and Laurie did a better job than I can in unpacking why it's there. But it's there. And I think that it's a mistake to leave it untouched and unchallenged. And there's this sort of assumption like, oh, we ought not talk about that. That person is just an old white crazy guy. Of course, he likes a little prison. But these are some of the leaders of a movement that we're all identifying with. And so I would encourage people to not necessarily give their money, but engage with those entities and say, look, I think there's ways that we could be more creative, look at, and take different tacks and try to be more inclusive.
Yeah, that's a wonderful note to end on. There's a lot of work that we can be doing. And as we post up this recording, we'll also put up a reading list. I'll hit up Leah and Laurie and Justin for some great recommendations. But I want to thank you all for your time. This was wonderful. I feel like I learned probably more than anyone here, and I enjoyed it incredibly. So thank you for your generosity with your time. It really means a lot to all of us, I think.
Thank you so much. I learned so much too. I appreciate it.
It's really great.
Right.
Thank you, everyone. Take care. We'll see you.
Great.